Good morning, everyone. My name is Yabanex Batista. I am the CEO of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. It is my pleasure to initially welcome you all to this first Caribbean Conservation Finance Congress, which for us, it is really a historic event. Further to the instructions already provided by my colleague on logistics, I would also like to indicate to everyone joining us this morning that we have interpretation in Spanish and in French for the duration of the whole event, including this session. You will find the button for interpretation at the bottom right of your screen. This event is co-organized by the CBF together with the National Conservation Trust Fund of St. Lucia, SLU-NCF. The idea for holding this event comes out of the need that we have seen in the CBF and a number of partner national conservation trust funds that we work with to create a community of practice focused on conservation finance for the Caribbean. When you look back at the history of conservation finance in our region and you go back to 2008, some of you may remember that in that year was when the Caribbean Challenge Initiative was originally launched with two main objectives: protecting 20% of the nearshore marine ecosystems of the countries that joined that initiative, and creating the sustainable finance mechanisms that would help the countries achieve that goal and continue actions into the future. The Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, together with a set of now 10 national conservation trust funds, are at the heart of that second goal of the CCI. Together, the 11 institutions form the Caribbean Sustainable Finance Architecture. We're all independent conservation trust funds that are dedicated to mobilizing resources for the conservation and sustainable finance agenda in the Caribbean and promoting the well-being of people and the environment. Today, the story of conservation finance is very different from what we had back in 2008 when the CCI was first launched. At that time, there was maybe 2 or 3 national level conservation trust funds in the insular Caribbean. There were maybe a few initial conservation gap analysis that were completed or partly completed. But today, we are talking about a landscape that has changed significantly with these 11 trust funds in place, with multiple partners working on creating new financial mechanisms to bring the very much needed resources that we need for the conservation agenda in the region. And that is what this Congress is about today. During this week of activities, which runs from today, July 6th, until Thursday, July 8th, we are gonna cover a number of very interesting topics, and I really invite you all to join as many sessions as possible. This first session is going to include our high-level opening panel. Session 2, which is later today, it includes a panel on the SIDS, the Small Island Development States 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Resource Mobilization. And session 3 this afternoon will focus on building sustainable finance mechanisms for the environment. Tomorrow, Wednesday, we are going to have our sessions on a Caribbean blue economy, climate finance for resilience, and voices from the field, which is going to bring the experience from practitioners from the ground and from the water on conservation finance throughout the region and other parts of the world as well. And on Thursday, we conclude our event with a panel on blended finance and impact investment approaches, a Caribbean Sustainable Finance Architecture Expo, and a closing panel on the way forward for sustainable financing in the Caribbean. So we hope you find the agenda interesting and that you can join us for as many sessions as possible. And with that said, I would like to now introduce Mr. Jens Mackensen, Chair of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund Board and also Head of the Latin America and Caribbean Agriculture and Environment Department of the German Development Bank, KfW. Jens, the floor is yours.
Thank you indeed, Yabanex. Highly appreciated. Esteemed participants, partners, colleagues, and friends, good morning to all and greetings from Frankfurt, Germany, which is, as you all know, part of the wider Caribbean in a way. And I'm particularly excited to see that so many participants join us today from all different angles of the world. That's highly encouraging, and thank you for your interest right from the outset. On behalf of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, I'd like to welcome you to this very first Caribbean Conservation Finance Congress. As Yabanex already mentioned, it is designed to bring together the conservation finance community of the Caribbean and its global partners. And therefore, this conference aims to showcase, discuss, advance conservation finance mechanisms designed by the Caribbean for the Caribbean, and to promote strong and long-term financing solutions and resource mobilization strategies for the Caribbean region. Lastly, also to promote an exchange and learning among Caribbean conservation finance actors and its global partners. As you know from practice, without local engagement and targeting financing, we will not be able to safeguard the Caribbean rich natural resource capital, to implement the incredible necessary nature-based solutions required to tackle climate change, to promote the green-blue recovery from the pandemic, and to maintain the ecosystem services, which are indeed crucial for people and local and national economies throughout the Caribbean. We at the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, and along with our partnering National Conservation Trust funds, started to build our Caribbean Sustainable Finance Architecture, which includes features such as an endowment fund for 10 national partners, 1 and hopefully soon 2 thematic facilities, as well as specific project financing, and of course, essential mobilization of local support. And in my opinion, to date, the initial results of that joint regional finance architecture are indeed very promising. There's a growing number of international donors which meet with an impressive array of very engaged local projects through our joint network. I find that encouraging and looking forward to continue that very path. Let us therefore continue to work also during this Congress to further contribute to our joint objectives in financing local conservation and livelihood projects in the Caribbean. Please enjoy and actively contribute to the stimulating agenda of this Congress. It is only with your input and contribution that we advance together our joint mission. It is also in this respect that I'd like to especially honor the presence of our 2 prominent keynote speakers, Jennifer Morris and Manuel Rodríguez. Putting together this virtual Congress has been a collective effort, and I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund, to Karolin, Troubetzkoy, and all her colleagues for being our co-host and organizer for this event. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all our sponsors of this first Caribbean Conservation Finance Congress, namely the Nature's Conservancy's Caribbean program and the German Ministry of Economic Development and Cooperation, along with the German Development Bank KfW. All 3 of them, by the way, being supporters of the very early days of the CBF. We also like to thank the colleagues and friends from the French Agency for Development and the French Global Environmental Fund, as well as the German Ministry of Environment as a key supporter to this particular event. Furthermore, our thanks goes to the CBF asset manager, Metzler and Payden, for all their support, and to the German Technical Corporation, GIZ, and specifically the Sustainable Marine Financing Project. And last but not least, surely a big thanks to Island Innovation as our partner for organizing this event. So indeed, it is great to have you all with us, and we are looking forward to the upcoming discussions of the first Caribbean Conservation Finance Congress. Thank you all. It's now my pleasure to turn over to you, Karolin, Chair of the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund.
Thank you, Jens. And a wonderful good morning and good afternoon to everyone. It's truly wonderful to see participants here all the way from Tanzania, Singapore, Croatia, Romania, just to name a few. So hello, everyone. As the chairwoman of the board and the secretariat of the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund, let me please add a word of welcome to this inaugural Caribbean Conservation Finance Congress. We here at the SLU NCF were approached by Yabanex Batista, the CEO that you just met of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, to be co-host of this special event. And we needed no convincing because we already understood how significant this opportunity would be, not only for us and the CBF, but for the advancement of the Caribbean sustainable finance architecture, which of course also includes a growing number of national conservation funds, such as our own, the San Lucia National Conservation Fund. It also underscored for us the degree of confidence that the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund has in the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund, which is a growing institution and which, for a fund still so young, has achieved many milestones, some of which I will take the time to mention later. We see this Congress as an important coming together of great minds, governments, private and public sector institutions, all with a vested interest in the Caribbean and determined to bring us closer towards the realization of our 2030 vision for the region as it relates to biodiversity and the conservation of our marine and coastal environments. We remember clearly, of course, the initial goals that were envisioned and are at the core of the Caribbean Challenge Initiative from its founding in 2008 at the 9th Convention of Biodiversity in Germany. And that's very dear to me because I also act as the envoy of the Caribbean Challenge Initiative since 2019. At that time in Germany, in 2008, some forward-thinking Caribbean leaders were inspired to act and find ways to enhance coastal and marine conservation efforts for us here in the region and in their respective countries. And they agreed at that time to accept the challenge to preserve and protect 20% of their coastal and marine resources by the year 2020. We have come a long way since then. Of note certainly is the first Caribbean Challenge Initiative Summit that was held in 2013 in the British Virgin Islands. That event brought together for the first time, not only Caribbean government leaders, but also business leaders and key development and multilateral agencies, private foundations and NGOs, all to agree on a shared vision for the region's marine and coastal environments, and to chart a course on how to achieve that vision. Most importantly, the leaders' declaration coming out of that summit spoke to the important goal of creating reliable, long-term funding for conservation and sustainable development in our Caribbean region. The result of this vision and the efforts undertaken by the Caribbean Challenge Initiative was the creation of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund in 2012. The CBF currently has two programs, as you heard from Yabanex, the Conservation Finance Program anchored by an 80 million endowment fund, that's US dollars, and a climate change program which is focused on ecosystem-based adaptation with a US 50 million sinking fund. The Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, together with their partner national conservation trust funds, such as our SLU NCF here, form the Caribbean Sustainable Finance Architecture. This network of independent trust funds, and there are currently 10 of them, is dedicated to mobilizing financial resources at the regional and the national levels for our conservation efforts in the Caribbean. Under the Conservation Finance Program of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, this endowment provides the financial resources through these eligible national trust funds that have signed a partnership agreement with the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, such as, again, our own St. Lucia National Conservation Fund. A key principle under the program is for the national conservation trust funds to create new and sustainable revenue that provides a minimum one-to-one match to the CBF resources. This requirement incentivizes the national conservation funds to establish financial mechanisms that can direct private or public resources to nature conservation and sustainable development. We here at the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund cannot speak highly enough of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund and their leadership, who have at all times been very forward-thinking and proactive in consolidating their role at that core of this Caribbean sustainable finance architecture. And they have guided the National Conservation Funds through various phases of their development to ensure their setup would allow them to be best poised to support our national conservation goals in our respective jurisdictions. Since becoming chairperson of the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund and also a CBF board director simultaneously in late 2020, I have been part of a very active dialogue and engagement with both locals and foreign partners. This made me realize that we have set for ourselves a very important and also very ambitious agenda that requires endless passion, total commitment, and consistently high levels of energy and effort to achieve our goals, however daunting and tedious these may seem at times. But secondly, and more importantly, we are at the right place at the right time to meet this challenge, as I believe that what we have done in the last decade is to lay a very solid foundation to propel us from ideas about conservation finance to actual tangible outcomes that are on course to materializing. In addition, the network of conservation funds that was created presents a stabilizing platform, which is great support when things get a little chaotic and uncertain at times. For example, when we are dealing with a terrible pandemic, a volcanic eruption in St. Vincent, or struggling through Hurricane Elsa, a storm with a strength that seemed to take most people by surprise. But such is the nature of the region we live in, vulnerable to disease, natural and man-made disasters that constantly threaten to disrupt our lives. These ongoing challenges we have to embrace and face head-on highlight the importance of our region's acceptance of the revised goal of 30% of marine and coastal resources protected and preserved by 2030. As the chairperson of the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund, I cannot speak highly enough of our first CEO, Dr. Vasanta Chase, and her successor, our just recently appointed CEO, Craig Henry, and our team. It is thanks to their commitment that our young institution has come so far since its incorporation in 2019. The St. Lucia National Conservation Fund has successfully managed to engage local partners, to diversify its donor funding profile beyond just the CBF endowment, such as our collaboration with the Massey Stores Environmental Program and the St. Lucia Tourism Enhancement Fund. The St. Lucia National Conservation Fund has launched several calls for proposals, attracting several local applicants from both public and private and also civil society sectors, and another call will be announced in the summer of 2021. Also, there are 4 grants currently in execution phase, with a few more grants awaiting approvals from us. We are proud that we could sign recently a major cooperative agreement with the Inter-American Foundation, and this represents a tremendous opportunity for capacity building for the SLU-NCF, for other conservation funds and local civil society organizations. I am pleased to say that the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund has a solid reputation as a well-structured conservation fund, and noted also for its contribution to many other networks, such as, for example, REDLAC, which is a network of environmental funds from Latin America and the Caribbean. And also we contribute to the soon to be established Caribbean Consortia of Conservation Fund. Finally, I would like to highlight our fund's success as an effective collaborator through its work with local agencies involved in the local conservation and livelihood support landscape, such as the Global Environmental Facility in St. Lucia local government departments, and agencies. All this to say that the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund, like our Caribbean Biodiversity Fund and our counterparts, are really at an important point where the only way is forward to more successes when it comes to improved conservation, management and creation of sustainable livelihoods, and funding for the preservation of our biodiversity and natural resources. Let me please single out Dr. Vasanta Chase, the former CEO of the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund, once more for her exemplary leadership and inspiration to her colleagues in St. Lucia and the wider Caribbean Conservation Network and beyond. I also look forward to working with our new CEO, Mr. Craig Henry, who has shown exceptional dedication and enthusiasm with the aim of leading our National Conservation Fund to even more successes. This Congress is a chance for us to dialogue and learn more about various actors in Caribbean conservation finance. A chance to showcase our successes, but also highlight the many challenges yet to overcome. And even more so, I sincerely hope that this Congress will be the gateway for new players to come to our conservation table and help us realize our vision and advance conservation finance mechanisms for us here in the Caribbean. I encourage you to participate and stay engaged as the days ahead proceed. I thank you all for the opportunity to address you today. I want to thank the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund and the team there for organizing this first ever Caribbean Conservation Finance Congress. And I thank you for your foresight and dedication to our Caribbean conservation agenda. I wish everyone a great Congress. Thank you very much. Back to you, Yaba. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karolin and Jens, for offering our official welcome remarks for this event. For those of you that have joined us recently, I would like to make a quick reminder on some logistical aspects. We have interpretation in Spanish and French. You can find that button at the bottom right of the Zoom screen. We would also like to remind you that everyone is muted and without camera. And when we move to the Q&A session with our panel, we ask you to please include your questions in the chat box, also found at the bottom of the screen. And now I would like to turn to our next part of this opening session, which is the keynote speech by Mr. Carlos Manuel Rodríguez, the CEO and Chairperson of the Global Environment Facility. Mr. Rodríguez, as many of you probably know, was 3 times Minister of Environment of Costa Rica and was also Vice President for Policy for Conservation International. He is a global champion for the environment, but also a global champion for sustainable finance. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Rodríguez, and thank you for being with us this morning.
Well, my pleasure, Yabanex, and let me begin by thanking Jens and Karolin for the introduction. And let me say hi to my dear friend and colleague, Jennifer Morris, and very happy to join you all in this, the first of its kind financial event for biodiversity in the Caribbean. Greetings from Costa Rica. I'm technically speaking in the Caribbean, not formally, because I'm in the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica, which is not formally part of the Caribbean as we know them as CARICOM. But nevertheless, I feel very acquainted and very close to everybody. This last week was a very unique week. I believe that this is the week where we need to really connect all dots. You know, we saw fire coming from the bottom of the ocean in the Gulf of Mexico. And in the northern Arctic zone of Norway was hotter than in Costa Rica. And I had never heard about that. And these are signs of the irrational systems that human has designed in order to produce our food, to generate our energy. And of course, we need to connect all of this with this dysfunctional relationship with nature. And just the pandemic is in the center of everything. Unfortunately, societies, people, governments, private sector hasn't been able to really understand. First, the fact that the pandemic was a direct effect of this dysfunctional relationship between humans and nature. And second, we talk about building back better. We talk about the green and blue, but as we began to deal and manage much better than a year ago, the pandemic, and began to see the stimulus plans and the ways by which countries are presenting and implementing ideas to build back better, I think that we're going back to where we were before the pandemic, and I think that's very serious. So this week for me was a very important week where we all need to really connect the dots. And when we realize that science, on one side, science has been telling this for a long, long time, and that Mother Nature is passing us a very big invoice, an environmental invoice, we need to think out of the box, think on ways by which we can put nature conservation and restoration in the front line of the stimulus packages and recovery plans, because this is our safety net. This is our, this is the investment that will help us not just do the leap forward in terms of a new development paradigm, but will help us be more resilient to future pandemics and extreme weather events. And in this context, the role of the Conservation Trust Fund, Biodiversity Trust Funds are key. And but I got a couple of recommendations on ways forward. First is, I come from Costa Rica, a country that has gone through the whole learning by doing process in terms of the finances of nature conservation. We began creating national parks with ODA resources. We even financed the park rangers with resources coming from abroad. And there was a moment that we were forced by our high human development standards to deal with those basic operational costs ourselves. And yes, of course, the government began putting resources. But eventually we found that that was not enough, and that we needed to create sustainable, innovative financial mechanisms. We began doing our first debt swaps and our first conservation endowments and funds, which were great. As a matter of fact, the outcomes of those conservation funds and endowment funds in the early days of conservation in Costa Rica by the mid to late 1980s and early 1990s were crucial for Costa Rica to consolidate a system of protected areas and to use it as the raw material for the biggest industry, which is ecotourism, not tourism. It is ecotourism. And today is very interesting because ecotourism has become the #1 source of rural income and jobs, higher than agriculture. And at the same time, ecotourism is providing us with sustainable finance of operation of protected areas. Before the pandemic, $35 million got into the system of protected areas directly through ecotourism. And here's where the government many years ago agreed to channel some of those resources through public-private initiatives that are dedicated to conservation and works hand in hand with the government. At the same time, we created other funds with domestic resources. Our conservation trust funds not only work with international financial aid, but also we were able to go to the next level by creating private-public management funds that work with domestic resources, because we come to realize, one, there is not enough resources coming from the public sector because of the never-ending fiscal deficits. ODA, Costa Rica being a country of high human development was not subject of support by ODS. So we had to be creative and create our own mechanisms. In the mid-1990s, we put a tax on fossil fuels, create a public-private forest fund that uses those resources to do payments for environmental services in private farms for people to restore and protect forests, consolidating the biological corridors. So that, in a nutshell, that is what has happened in Costa Rica. But besides telling this story, I think that high support from the NGOs like DNC, Conservation International, WWF, also highly supported by bilateral cooperation. USAID was crucial in those days, and most of the Europeans bilateral donors were supporting that. But then the country realized that it's in their own self-interest to have a diversified source of funding for conservation. And it helped by allocating resources coming from tourism into the National Park Service. It helped create the tax on fossil fuels that pays people for sequestrating carbon. And at the same time, that continues to provide large sums of money through public expenditures for the nature conservation. And that is the result, I will say, of Costa Ricans understanding that is in their own self-interest to protect nature. It gives us a lot of dividends and returns, not just the very clear one that you see in the national accounting system or whenever you do your GDP analysis, which is tourism, but also those who are less easy to measure, but are as valuable as the first one, which is, what is the economic benefit of restoring the landscape, having twice as much forest than before during hurricane season, when the hurricane hit us in Costa Rica. And the best example is what happened last November, where 2 hurricanes back to back in 15 days, Category 4, hit Central America. Mainly Nicaragua and Honduras, and just once more, the country that stood better the impact on infrastructure out of the hurricanes for Costa Rica, and that is due to the fact that Costa Rica has way more forests than the other countries. The less forests, the more vulnerable to climate change and to extreme weather events and to hurricanes, and this is something that is not there yet. In the mind of decision makers, still not there yet in how we plan and assign resources. And that is why the conservation trust funds play a big role. So the GF help Costa Rica and many of the countries. And here the two elements that I want to bring to your attention today. One is that as we keep on consolidating, diversifying, and looking towards the financial sustainability of all of our funds, and yes, you can count with the GF, trust funds, conservation funds, biodiversity funds needs to be working right next to governments, so they can really understand that through these public, private schemes, the governments are going to be able to achieve their commitment to the international environmental conventions, particularly the 1.5 degree target and the 30% global conservation goals. Countries are following what the science is telling. Never in my life I've seen, the political willness and the awareness of public opinion so close to what scientists are telling us in terms of, we need to protect 30% of the planet, the ocean, and the land, way beyond, way beyond a strict system of protected areas. But at the same time, not many countries are very clear on how they are going to implement it. They're very enthusiastic in promoting and agreeing on the 30%, but then how are they going to implement that? And that is not an easy task. So national, regional biodiversity conservation trust funds should be right there, right next to the government, helping them in understanding which are the cost-effective ways by doing that. I see that here many of the biodiversity conservation funds in the Caribbean works a lot in the ecosystem-based adaptation. which is a double benefit. You're protecting nature, you're protecting biodiversity at the same time that you invest in becoming more resilient, in adapting to climate change. So that is a key element. And my second and final message from the GF, and this is very important to me. GF resources are channeled to countries because the GF is a political partnership created 30 years ago when the industrialized countries channel financial resources to countries, to developing countries to achieve their commitments in fulfilling their goals and targets with the global environmental conventions. So the money goes to government, to countries. But for me, as a politician, there's a very clear difference within a country and a government. These are monies to the country, not this. And I got it very, very clear. As I began, I will be trying to do my efforts with my council to be able to create new ways by which major stakeholders, particularly non-state stakeholders, can access directly GF resources. And this can mean that biodiversity conservation, trust funds and endowments may access resources from the GF in a very different circumstance to what we have done it in the past, because in the past is all of these financial requests that has been presented to the GF has to go through the central government to the operation to the political focal point. And I'm working on ways by which we can continue and even expand our possibilities to financially support funds without going directly to the political process of the star allocation, which is, putting money into competence. Most Caribbean countries receive a little amount of resources of the GF, and I want to be able to expand that by also bringing one element which is key as we distribute the GF resources, which is the the vulnerability element. We need to put the vulnerability element and give weight to that so Caribbean islands can access more resources, because according to the GF criteria, the higher your GDP, the less resources you may get from the GF, and sometimes that is unfair, sometimes that is on non-strategic, and I think that that those countries which are more vulnerable to climate change should be in the front line of being able to access resources. My final, Yabanex, I got a request here to our friends from the Caribbean. I don't call them seats, small island development states anymore, because these are large oceanic islands. So I call them LOCs, large oceanic small island developing states, because this is what they are. Without their natural capital, with their large oceanic territories, we will never achieve our climate objectives. And just, of course, the very unique and valuable biodiversity of the Caribbean is extremely important. 70% of all plants in the islands are endemic. And yes, of course, we know a lot about the Saint Vincent and the Saint Lucia parrots as, flagship species, but they got everything. All kind of endemic species from the whistling duck all the way to the hummingbirds, very important sites for us to protect and to engage. So thank you so much, Yabanex, for the opportunity of sharing some views, some ideas, and a couple of recommendations to our colleagues from the Caribbean. The GF will continue to be a strong, solid partner in the future with the Caribbean islands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carlos Manuel Rodríguez, for your keynote speech and all the views you provided on the value of sustainable financing, and particularly conservation trust funds in the current environmental agenda, but also into the future. I would like now to introduce Jennifer Morris, the CEO of the Nature Conservancy, a great partner of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund and one of our founding members. For the past 25 years, Ms. Morris has dedicated her life to protecting the environment for both people and nature. And she is truly a champion for the environment and also for sustainable financing. Her global experience is just incredible. She has worked with local communities. She has interacted with governments. She has focused on topics related to indigenous people, multinational corporations. Her experience is really vast. And it is really a pleasure to welcome you to this first Caribbean Conservation Finance Congress, Ms. Morris. And first, we would like you to first offer some words based on the keynote speech offered by Mr. Rodríguez, and then we will move to the conversation panel between both of you. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Yaba. It's wonderful to be with all of you. Jens, Karolin, Carlos Manuel, what a fantastic overview. And I'm thrilled to be here at the first inaugural Caribbean Finance Congress. This is such an important time as we see what's happening now globally with Hurricane Elsa raging through your region right now. My heart goes out to everyone who is dealing with the impacts of that hurricane. And unfortunately, as we know, with climate change being the freight train coming down on all of us, the importance of this discussion today could not be more critical as we think about the future and recovering from the pandemic, as well as addressing the climate crisis. Now is the time that we come together as a region, as a community, and develop innovative solutions to ensure that that natural capital, that natural base that sustains us all, as Carlos Manuel presented so eloquently, is key. And so I'm so thrilled to be here. I wanted to share a couple of reflections, and first just note that Carlos Manuel, as Yaba mentioned, is truly a champion for this space. I can't think of anyone better to lead the Global Environment Facility, the largest public financing mechanism for biodiversity on the planet, than Carlos Manuel, with both his deep public experience in Costa Rica, global experience with Conservation International, where I was thrilled to work with him for many, many years. And now, of course, being a champion for nature everywhere he goes. And you heard that from his incredible discussion and his keynote address. I'd like to just also mention a couple of things about the Nature Conservancy in the region. We, as Jens mentioned, TNC has been a supporter of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund since the very, very beginning. And we're thrilled to be a core part of supporting governments and civil society in the region, where we have operations in 6 countries throughout the region directly on the ground, and we're supporting another 10, in fact, are in 7 on the boards of 7 of the conservation trust funds in the region. And so we're just so thrilled to be able to play a critical role in supporting local efforts to ensure that biodiversity is protected. So as Carlos Manuel mentioned, nature is our safety net. And as we know from science, we have to ensure that nature is diverse, and not only for the importance for watersheds and pollinators and all the great things that nature provides, but of critical importance in your region, which has become so clear under the pandemic, is the critical role that, of course, tourism plays in your economies. And so as we think about this Congress and the discussions that we're going to have today and the role of the conservation trust funds play in the region, thinking about diversity, not only in nature, but in our economies, is so key. If I think about what's happened with the pandemic and the economies of this region, which you all are experiencing directly, and the role that tourism plays when we have a pandemic that is hurting us all so much. You know, the economic impact in 2020 from COVID in the region from tourism and travel, it's lost 1.7 million tourism jobs estimated. $36 billion, 62% of GDP in the region. International arrivals, of course, have been down by 60 and probably more in many countries %. Now, some of the world is recovering, of course. And as Carlos Manuel mentioned, as we recover, we need to make sure that we recover in the right way, that we build back better, that we invest in nature, not only for all of the great reasons that we know as conservationists and practitioners in the space, but also because that will bring back tourism. And if we develop in a way that's not conducive to, as Carlos Manuel mentioned, sustainable tourism, ecotourism, I fear that it will really undermine the fabric of the societies in the region. And so making sure that we not only invest in nature for diversified economies, but also for future health. So one interesting thing that Carlos Manuel mentioned, and that also the World Health Organization has said, not a conservation organization, the World Health Organization has said the most important way to prevent the next pandemic is to protect nature. So that connection between our own human health, nature conservation, and our economies has never been clearer than it is today. So I'm thrilled to be here with all of you, and I look forward to discussing now with Yaba moderating how we can, as practitioners, ensure that we do build back better, that we create diversified economies, and that we really come up with innovative solutions that can scale and that can quickly invest, working with the private sector as well, into mechanisms that will ensure nature conservation and prevent the next pandemic. So Yaba, back to you.
Thank you very much for your words, and really having both of you with us this morning. It's truly amazing to be able to listen to how you bring that local experience to the global stage and back to the local scenarios. It's truly inspiring. So now we're going to move now into a brief session of dialogue with Carlos Manuel and Jennifer. Carlos Manuel, if you can turn on your screen, hopefully your connection is working. I believe so.
Yeah, I'm here.
Great, thank you. So both of you talked during your remarks about the importance of the international targets. And as we know, the world is currently negotiating, the countries are negotiating the new 30 by 30 targets. This is being reflected in the different preparatory meetings preceding the Convention on Biological Diversity COP and the Convention on Climate Change that are coming up in the next few months. And a lot of attention is being dedicated to that 30 by 30 target, which is more ambitious than what the world had before. But we also are hearing, and particularly in the large ocean states, Carlos Manuel, we hear a worry. We often hear, yes, we want more ambition. Yes, we know that is needed, but we need equal ambition for resource mobilization. And I would like to pose to both of you the following questions. What from your point of view, is required to ensure that the global ambition on targets for conservation and protection is equally met by ambitious resource mobilization targets? Not sure if one of you wants to tackle that first.
Carlos, do you want to go first?
Well, normally in the Caribbean, we say ladies first.
I'm happy to. I'm happy to go. I hope it's not just in the Caribbean. I'm happy to go first. So thanks for that question, Yaba. This is obviously a critical thing. And as we often say, conservation without money is just conversation. So we've absolutely got to see resource mobilization following these important targets. And I think one of the most crucial initial ways is for the countries themselves to develop national biodiversity financing plans. So the mobilization will require clear strategies that of course make the critical business case for where to invest, how to leverage financing, public financing with private, et cetera. So it's really critical that each country comes up with these national biodiversity financing plans. You know, the Nature Conservancy with the Paulson Institute and Cornell University did a recent global study, which we shared with Carlos Manuel, which came up with a global target of over $700 billion a year that we need. There's a gap there of $700 billion a year that we need as a global society to invest in nature to protect everything that we need to protect to achieve the 30 by 30 goals. Now, that cannot come about without really smart leveraged investments. And it also, I would suggest, each country, each region needs to do their own analysis that sort of is a parallel for a local nationalized approach to really understand what budget and tax policies are actually undermining investments. We can do all sorts of great things investing in conservation, but if our public policies are undermining through harmful subsidies, whether they're agricultural based or others, then that we really aren't going to achieve that gap. And in fact, that $700 billion is mostly represented by harmful subsidies. So taking a look at that, really understanding the policy coherence of the government's approaches to conservation, I think is a key critical first step.
Great, thanks. And great that you mentioned, Jennifer, the Paulson Institute TNC financing nature on closing the global gap. That is key, because it not only tells us the size of the gap, but it tells us that it's in our own self-interest to be investing in nature conservation. And here's my point, Java. No country in the planet questions how much should they invest in education or healthcare, or as a matter of fact, they don't condition investment in education and healthcare to more ODA, because every single country understands that the return on investing in their people in health and education is a very, very high return. So countries need to understand that it's in their own self-interest to mobilize more efficiently financial resources at the domestic level, as of course ODA should increase. But the bottom line here, Java, is that as countries, the industrialized countries, do a additional effort to channel and increase more resources, recipient countries, developing countries, and middle-income nations need to be more policy coherent, as Jennifer said, and began phasing out all the perverse investment and incentives that they have in place that continues to have a high environmental cost. It doesn't make any sense for a developed nation, even for the GF, it doesn't make any sense to put a lot of resources in a country that still promotes, still have fuel subsidies for the bottom trawling, or keeps on having subsidies for land use change and deforestation in the big agricultural sector, or still have big subsidies and do invest through public banks in the oil and gas industry. So we need coherence on every single element in place. And also it is very important because Jennifer mentioned the need to have financial plans at the country level. Java, we don't know at this point how much money every single country of the planet is investing in biodiversity. You can go through around the world and see how many resources are being invested in education, poverty alleviation, housing, hospital, healthcare. But when you talk about biodiversity investment, climate investment, nature conservation, that information is not there. You need to hire an archaeologist and send him into the Minister of Finance so he can dig inside the budget to try to find how much money is the country investing. If you don't know how much money are you investing, you probably don't know how much money you need to protect biodiversity according to your NBSAP or according to your commitment to the International Convention. As you do your expenditure review, you will do the financial need. You have the gap and understanding what is the gap for my country. And here's where all possible funding sources come together to narrow down that gap. And narrowing finally, Java, narrowing the domestic financial gap is not going to be done by putting more pressure to the north to put more resources. Is once more be generating more coherent in your development policies and stop changing the boundaries of a protected areas to do large-scale tourist development, because that is not going to help to protect nature and to become more resilient to global events like future pandemics and climate change.
Thank you. Both of you mentioned the importance of knowing how much we are investing now so that we know what else needs to be mobilized. Jennifer talked about the importance of the financial plans. Both of you also mentioned the importance of policy actions for governments through policy decisions to give further direction on how to continue to advance this conservation finance agenda into the future. That is something that in the architecture overall, in the CBF, the National Conservation Trust Funds, we are aiming to do. We are working on trying to move that part of the agenda as well. But there is one particular element that I personally feel that it's often missing from the picture, and sometimes, depending on the point of view, it's seen as a barrier for moving forward, and that is the lack of information or science behind some of these aspects. And that is actually my next question for both of you. What would be, in your view, the role of science in developing future or current and future financial mechanisms in general throughout the world? But if you have any particular points to share for the Caribbean, that would be important and interesting to hear from you. And perhaps again, Jennifer, if you could take a first stab at this question, knowing that the Nature Conservancy is a science-based institution, what is your take on the role of science and financial mechanisms?
Yeah, thanks so much, Yaba, for that question. So the role of science is of course crucial. I would posit it's crucial for not only understanding nature better, but also valuing nature better. And to pick up Carlos Manuel's important comment related to, we know how much we spend on education and the value of that, no one questions it. Science will help us understand the value of nature. And so I sort of sit at this important intersection of bringing science to policymakers and ensuring that applied science we can actually show through economic analysis and biodiversity science analysis the role that nature plays in protecting humans. And I think that is the critical nexus that our science can play. And I can give a couple of examples. I mean, the Nature Conservancy with local partners have looked at a lot of different reef and coral reef and mangrove preservation projects in the Dominican Republic and Jamaica and Grenada. And in each of these places, we're seeing incredible benefits that natural capital has played. In the Dominican Republic alone, by protecting mangrove and reef ecosystems, we've been able to demonstrate through these analyses of $96 million in annual avoided loss as a direct result of having those ecosystems intact. So having a control group and a place where we've actually lost that ecosystem, and really being able to use science to inform policymakers, this is why you need to invest. And not doing the science because it's important just to do from biodiversity. Of course it's important. There's so many species, especially in ocean environments, we just don't even know about, we haven't discovered yet. That's critical. But bringing that science to the right people who maybe don't understand the critical role that they play in the intact ecosystems play in the economies of these places, I think is the absolute essential role of science. And we really look forward to, as the Nature Conservancy and other partners, to working with the trust funds to show their impacts in science, to bring that knowledge to local leaders as well, to say the value the trust funds are providing in the conservation of nature, which directly links to the economies.
Carlos Manuel, what's your take on the role of science now that you are at the GEF and coming from that world before, where you also worked on that intersection of policy and science, and now managing the largest environmental fund in the world? How does science play a role from your point of view?
Well, thanks, Java. As an environmental lawyer, as you can imagine, I've been working in the interface of science and policy making. Probably two-thirds of my life, I've been quite frustrated to the fact that I don't see much progress in that field of work. But at the same time, let me say that that having been a climate and CBD UNCCD negotiator for 25 years, I never seen such a great opportunity to bring together the science into the major decision-making process as today. we got the 1.5%. We got the net zero land degradation in place. We are very close to have the 30%, and this is due to to the undisputable the science behind it. And the leaders pledge to nature that happened last year during the UN General Assembly, where we had 73 leaders, head of states, prime ministers, presidents committing to the 30%, having a high ambition coalition for nature and people. This was at the ministerial level, 75 ministers of the world. Makes me feel that never before we've been so close one to the other. So here, having the decision makers on board, having the political willingness on board is unique. So here, as you said, the most challenging element is how do we mobilize financial resources from all sources in a very efficient way that can give the decision makers, head of states, the right conditions for them to do the transformational efforts that they are required to. And that is the most important challenges. In this context, conservation trust funds, biodiversity funds play a critical role, and that is how we see it in the GF. That is why we are going to be extremely ambitious in ways by which we can channel more resources than what we have done in the past through new innovative mechanisms in the GF, so we can continue supporting the country's conservation goals through these different initiatives.
Thank you. During the conversation so far, we have been talking about the importance of conservation trust funds, creating new financial mechanisms, and that we are truly in an inflection point from a political perspective, from a science perspective, from a multi-crisis perspective on climate change, biodiversity loss, health, etc. When we look back at the recent history of conservation finance, we have seen that there is quite some proliferation in terms of the creation of different funds. Conservation trust funds, we have funds that are managed by bilateral agencies, we have funds managed by multilateral agencies, we have foundations creating their own funds focused on these areas related to environment. So in some ways, we could claim as a conservation finance community that we have been somewhat successful in raising attention to the importance of bringing more resources to the table. So that could be labeled success. But at the same time, one of the concerns that some sectors also bring forward is that with so many funds proliferating everywhere, aren't we dispersing the efforts? Aren't we doing double work? Isn't it a more complicated landscape for the conservation finance work that we need to do into the future? So what would you say can be done then to better work on synergies between all these sources of funding, particularly funds that work at the global level, regional level, or the national level? And within that question, what would you also consider is the role of the private sector and how the private sector can be truly integrated into this process? Jennifer?
Sure. So, I think there's some wonderful mechanisms now that bring all these different pieces together. And just to answer your kind of more the controversial side of your question, which is, should there be so many smaller funds around there? I get that question, but I actually think it's really important. I think each nation of the Caribbean has its own culture, its own history, its own future, quite frankly. And so having national level funds, I think is important. But to your point, Yaba, of course, to ensure synergies, collaboration through mechanisms like REDLAC are great. I think the Conservation Finance Alliance is another one that's more global. But of course, there could be mechanisms now for, as you mentioned, to bring in the private sector and other civil society groups to the table through a coordinated way, maybe a biodiversity funding roundtable that could really help generate not only technical sharing, which of course REDLAC already does at the fund level, but could think about, you know, innovations using the private sector mechanisms in a different way. And I'll give you maybe just two very quick examples of things with the private sector that TNC has been piloting in the region and that would love to see the trust funds get involved more with. And that is one around insurance mechanisms. So we did this parametric insurance initiative pilot in the Yucatan a few years ago, and basically to have the local government create a structure working with a Swiss Re insurer as well as the tourism sector to help with the financing and protection and valuing of natural capital as a real insurable asset, and that is the coral reefs in that area. And that payment scheme we learned a lot about, but it did pay out over $800,000 recently as a result of Hurricane Delta that came through with over 100 knot winds, which destroyed the reef, and was able to deploy financing very quickly within 20 days. Now, we wanted it in 10 days, so a lot to learn there. But I think that's an example of innovation, and I think a role that the conservation trust funds could help replicate in other countries. The second thing I would mention is this whole area, and Carlos Manuel and I have been talking about this quite a lot, of debt for nature swaps and how we can look at post-COVID recovery, especially in island nations in the Caribbean that have been really hardly impacted, as I mentioned, from tourism drops, how we can look at refinancing debt that requires a 30 by 30 commitment, and then also enables countries to refinance their debt obligations to private sector, primarily private sector lenders. So we've done that in the Seychelles a few years ago. We're now looking at several places that are quite advanced actually in the Caribbean to do something similar. So those are just two examples of where I think we can leverage the opportunities to bring the private sector together and really scale innovations in a way that we haven't before.
Thank you, Carlos Manuel. What's your take?
Okay, so I never heard of a country that complains that they got too many schools or hospitals. I don't see the same situation with too many conservation partners or funds or endowment, and this is what we need to understand. We need them. We at the GF we provide funding for projects that are aiming to move the needle, to have an impact, that can really aim for the system change, and we do our best effort. But for me, there is no better investment than investing in a conservation trust fund or a biodiversity fund, because it gives me the financial sustainability for the long term. So that is why they are so important. My point at my initial remark is that at this point, I don't see the trust fund being a very visible political partner at the highest political level, as ministers and head of states are committing to these very ambitious goals, climate goals, nature conservation goals. We aim to be nature positive by 2030. That means that we are going to move that oil tanker into a very different direction where today is heading for, and that is not easy for a leader, for a political leader. On the other side, the private sector is a strong ally. It can help, but it will help, from the very philanthropic point of view. We need to understand that the private sector is a key actor, as they are 80% of the labor force, 80% of our economy. So they will be doing the right things if the legal frameworks and the policy frameworks are in place. They're not going to, they are not a philanthropic organization. They do business. And if doing business implies that they need to protect nature by, having government changing incentives and economic regulations and doing the, economic leveling, the economic playing field, the private sector will come in big time. So the big challenge with the private sector is, let me give you an example, the green tax reform. We need to pass the tax burden from taxpayers to polluters. And this is where you will see the positive impact of the private sector, which will be moving that oil tanker in the right direction, because it makes business sense to protect nature. At this point, we lost forests all over the planet because for the corporate world, it doesn't make any sense to protect the forests. As a matter of fact, in many countries, it is still a barrier for them to do business, particularly the agronomic sector. The future of the conservation funds are associated to them to do two things, Jave. One is to really understand themselves, their role in implementing and supporting the political vision and commitment of their countries. And second, to be able to understand that their financial sustainability is based on creating domestic financial mechanisms, particularly if they understand very well how they can play a role in payments for environmental services, which is something that is coming at the policy level, at the legal framework level, very, very fast. And you will need that expertise in terms of the financial management, in terms of the proper architectures at the country level to manage in a very transparent, accurate, reliable manner resources that will come. So countries should establish a PS on water. Those who use water should pay for the real cost of the water. You need an organization, recollecting and investing in monitoring. You need to offset your carbon footprint, and that can be a good business at the country level. You can have a carbon market system. You can do it in biodiversity. In the Caribbean islands is a good example of the potential to use to design a PS on biodiversity, as the big industry in the Caribbean is the tourist sector. The tourist sector is free riding the system, because it's the government and the conservation who are investing in landscapes and seascapes, in nature conservation, and the others are profiting out of that without really returning, or let me put it the other way, without paying for the service they are being provided with. So I see a future of financial sustainability of national conservation biodiversity trust funds related to the development of payment for environmental services, being water, carbon, or biodiversity. And that is kind of the new frontier for many of these funds.
Thank you. We have talked about policy, private sector engagement, the need of financial plans, the international negotiations, but there is one element that we have not touched upon yet. And I'm going to start moving to the questions from the audience. And one of these questions was actually popping up in my mind before I saw it. So I'm thankful for the audience for bringing this forward. And I would like to direct this question specifically to you, Jen. What is the role here of civil society in conservation financing beyond just being grant recipients?
Sure. So, I'll just give the example of our experience with the Nature Conservancy in the region. And we came in with early risk capital, and I want to give a huge shout out to, the individuals that supported this investment in the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, as well as a lot of the national trust funds, where, other bigger players maybe were waiting to see other financing coming in. I also just want to give a huge thanks to Jens, Mackensen, and KfW for all of the incredible investment that they have put into the region. It has been substantial and has really benefited many of the funds that are represented here today. So what the role of civil society can play is many different roles. A critical one, of course, we mentioned before, is, in addition to the capital, is science, is bringing that science to policymakers to ensure that they understand the critical fabric that nature provides to the economies and to, of course, to our basic human livelihoods in the region. And I think that's another key role. We can also be conveners. We can be supporters of, international efforts that will highlight what's happening in the region and bring it to other regions as an example. So convener, developer, risk capital taker, bringing in the private sector where smaller civil society organizations may not have the capacity to do that, where we could bring in the private sector to think about how we can, again, create these innovative schemes which can scale. So those are some of the many ways that civil society, I think, can play a critical role. And also, of course, working directly with the governments, which is key. I think that is a role that TNC and many of the larger NGOs, as well as the local civil society organizations, have played over the years to again, promote and accelerate the investments in nature that we all need to ensure our own livelihoods going forward. So those are a few of the different ways.
Thank you. And I think it's key what you were mentioning at the end, that this is not only a role for civil society at the international level with the big international NGOs, but also for regional and local national level NGOs and civil society who can play this role. A related question to this for you, Carlos Manuel, coming now that you're at the GEF, is related to project cycles and grant making. One of our attendees is asking, how do we really turn project and grant making into true sustainable financing mechanisms for conservation? And I think this is quite an interesting question, because in the donor world, we often in this part of the world that is not necessarily the big donor world, we have to always run after project cycles and make sure that we are submitting project documents on time, and then those projects need to be implemented in 3 years, and otherwise the project ends and you have to return money and all those things. But we also know that creating the enabling environment and through financial mechanisms for conservation goes beyond just a project cycle. How do you tackle that?
That's a very good question. And I still ask myself that same question. So to give you the right perspective, Java, the GF is the biggest donor on an annual basis for nature conservation. We invest around $650 million every year. And everybody can say that's a lot of money, but this is just 0.5% of what we are actually investing on an annual basis. So for a better understanding, 80% of what we invest on an annual basis, which is around $125 billion, are public expenditures. 20%, the other 20% is multilateral, bilateral, and private sector. And here's where we are. So we are just investing 0.5% of what it is invested on an annual basis. I may be extremely charismatic, very smart, very good, and double and triple the size of the GF Trust Fund, that will never be enough to achieve what countries are willing to do at the national level and to achieve what countries want to do at the international level. So I need to be very strategic on how we invest those resources. And at the end of the day, $650 million in between 130, 140 countries. I mean, that is not much money. We spread too thin. And there are all kinds of political complexities associated with this. I'm making it easy to understand. Here's to say that we really see what is coming to us from the countries, political priorities. Every single country has with the finance in a way we are investing are those areas of work at the country that can be sustainable. And yes, of course, the co-financing is high. It is important, but it's never enough. So this is a matter of how countries understand what are their priorities in terms of the very specific topics. We used to finance on silos, finance biodiversity here, climate change over there, land degradation over there, international freshwater over here. Now we do it in a more holistic, integrated approach with the impact programs. We did that since CCFC. We went from now in GF8, we're proposing to increase the training on issues related with resilience. So we're moving towards that direction of more comprehensive in what we do, because we recognize that the resources may not be enough to supply. Two things are very, very important. Countries need to understand that the GF resources will be investments that will catalyze works, incentives, and institutions in a way that they can overcome the lack of policy coherence, and they can mobilize domestic resources more efficiently. Because at the end of the day, at the very, very end of the day, we will have positive aspiration in terms of nature and climate if countries invest more efficiently at the domestic level. They need to phase out, they need to defund deforestation, they need to defund all of those investments that contributes to the loss of marine ecosystems, and they need to really focus on that change. So they need to first, one, recognize the market failure and begin assigning value to environmental services, internalize the negative externalities by doing tax reform. And on the other side, we need to deal with the institutional failure. We still work on silos. We got a ministry or a public agency for every single natural resource, one for mining, one for energy, one for domestic biodiversity. They call it the Ministry of Agriculture. Then one for fisheries and one for nature conservation. We work at the institutional level on silos, and that is not going to help us. And if we tend to believe that we'll do the leap forward in terms of our aspiration for sustainability with the same institutional framework that in first place created the problem, I think that we'll never achieve our 2030 development goals.
Thank you, Carlos Manuel. We were having some technical difficulties with your audio. We have turned off your video and put your placard on screen to see if that helps us. Just so you know.
Thanks.
We are approaching the end of this session, but there are a couple of questions here that are related to communication. And before giving you a chance to provide some last words for us and the full audience, could you tell us more about how we conservation trust funds, the conservation finance community, needs to take on a more robust approach to communication, to perhaps communicate that term that you indicated, Carlos Manuel, the environmental invoice. How is it that we need to better communicate with policymakers, with the science makers in this world of conservation finance? Jennifer?
Sure. I mean, I think we've talked about this a little bit, but I think just to put a fine point on it, we need to have data that will resonate with the right policymakers. So it's not just about the environment ministers, right? It's about the fishing ministers. It's about the finance ministers, the planning ministry. It's really about bringing data that they care about into the halls of power within your various countries to show them the analysis that makes sense to them. So as Carlos Manuel knows so well and has been right at the center of this and has been, my mentor on this for many years, you can't just talk about conservation to conservationists. You've got to be able to translate that data into economic analysis that will resonate with people who control the seats of power, quite frankly. I mean, ministers of environment are often not cabinet positions or even very senior sometimes in countries. So how do we make sure that we're reaching the right people? And I think that's the communication genius that we need to unpack. And I think some countries are doing it very, very well. Of course, in a region like the Caribbean, where so much of the economic base is on ecotourism, it makes a lot of sense to be able to do that. And a lot of leaders understand that. But I think we can just do a much, much better job. And that means, quite frankly, bringing more economists to the table, natural resource economists, so that it's translating that data on biology into real clear policy recommendations that can make a difference. So I think that's the strategic communications that we can do a much better job on as a global community. And TNC certainly stands ready through many of our analysis, the Mapping Ocean Wealth Initiative, for example, and many others that lots of partners are doing to help the trust funds be able to make that argument. But the trust funds are in a really critical role. They're people from the nation, supported by the governments, with government officials on these boards. So to be able to do that with them in a very strategic, forward-looking way that looks at pandemic recovery, tourism recovery, and of course, nature conservation. I think that all the elements are in place now, and we just need to have the right messages, and that translation can be made through economists, quite frankly.
Thank you, Jennifer. Carlos Manuel, the role of communication in our work.
Well, Jennifer mentioned most of it, and I think that besides the ways that we can improve, it is in the eyes and in the face of everybody. I mean, the pandemic is a good example, but most importantly, in LOCs, the impact of climate change is something that is evident. They are suffering themselves. And that is key in the context of bringing all the stakeholders in. And this is why the GF, like a project, loves to work with countries like the project that we were talking the other day, Java, the Bluefin, the Caribbean Blue Economy Financing Project. This is an excellent project initiative. We love it at the GF because here we see the sum of political willness, institutional capacity, and vision all together. This is what excites us a lot in understanding that there are countries who are really doing the extra mile effort, not just in generating conservation outcomes and outputs, or just and with the co-benefit in terms of social well-being, but also the level of ambition in terms of the paradigm shift from the economic point of view. So here you will be talking about fisheries, you will be talking about plastic, you will be talking about energy efficiency. Here you're going to be speaking about land use and land use planning and land use monitoring. I mean, this is kind of the big enchilada projects that I love to see at the sub-national level, because very few countries can have that at the national level. But well, we understand that this is a bottom-up approach, and in the Caribbean nations, this is a great way of pushing it forward. So I'm really delighted to see on the pipeline this great project, this great approach, and this is a good example of the things that we need to do with our very limited resources.
Thank you so much, Carlos Manuel. We are also very excited at the CBF with the Caribbean Bluefin project. We were really thrilled to hear that the project information note or form was approved by the GEF Council. And you can be assured that we are going to work tirelessly to make sure that the full project design comes to your desk next year. And we will be doing this work in partnership with our colleagues from UNEP and also the Nature Conservancy. I want to give the floor back to you for one last time before we close. Jennifer, the last session of this Congress is going to be on the way forward for conservation finance in the Caribbean. So we still have many topics to be discussed, but in your mind, if you were to give us 3 or 4 words about what that future for conservation finance should look like, what would those be?
Great, thanks, Yaba. So first, I just want to say thanks to all of you for inviting me here today, and to really celebrate the this first inaugural conference, and of course, to recognize the critical path that the Caribbean Challenge Initiative took back many years ago to kind of kick off the whole trust fund movement in this region. If I could give you maybe 5 words, it would be 3 words, take more risk. I think that and that goes for not just the funds themselves, because of course the donors to these funds. I think the time is absolutely running out for us to be creative, to be innovative, to bring in the private sector, to think about replicating some of the great work that's already happened, but to really scale it. And that requires donors, partners, governments to sit down together and come up with creative solutions for change, because we don't have any time to wait. So please take more risk. Those would be my 3 words of wisdom, if wisdom is there. Carlos?
Well, I will say, I will use 6 words, which will be take more risk and engage politically. Those are my words. The Conservation Trust Funds, Biodiversity Trust Fund are the partner of choice of governments in terms of the long-term investment in the sustainability. They need to be in the radar of policymakers, otherwise policymakers will be more worried and will be conditioning climate and nature action for more ODA, which is not what we want to see at the end of the day. We need enlightened leaders that understand that the homework is a domestic homework, that the international aid will catalyze processes, and at the end of the day, it's in their own self-interest to invest in nature because of the human well-being benefits.
Great, thank you very much. I think your connection is better now, Carlos Manuel. I think we can turn off your screen so we can, Jen and I can see you for the official closing of this session. I would really like to thank both of you truly for being with us this morning. Your words, the way you've been so candid about what needs to be done and how it should be done are truly inspiring, and they are not really up there in the stratosphere. Your words are practical, and I think that's very important, that all of us that work in this field of conservation finance, we need to be practical to find those financing solutions that are going to help us ensure that nature continues to provide us with what we need into the future. And before leaving and closing the session, I would like to invite Karolin and Jens to also join us on screen, and maybe we can do a very quick group picture of this historic moment of the first Caribbean Conservation Finance Congress. So make sure you have your cameras on and smile for the picture before we close. Great, thank you very much. Jennifer, Carlos Manuel, Jens, and Karolin, for all your support. We are sure we're gonna count with your support and wisdom the rest of the journey of this Conservation Trust Fund, Caribbean Conservation Finance Congress, and also into the future. And for our audience, please join us in about 25 minutes for the second session of the Congress, which is, maybe we need to change the title to Land, Ocean, States, and the Resource Mobilization Agenda for 2030. Thank you so much, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank
Gracias.
you.
Ciao.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.